Good afternoon and welcome to our expert seminar, Incident and Crisis Management, Working Together to Bring Order to Chaos. This seminar is being recorded and it will be made available on the technical library page of our website afterwards. And everyone who registered for today will receive a link by email. If at any point during the presentation you have any questions, please type those into the chat box and one of the presenters will try to get to as many of them as possible after the presentation. Today you'll hear from Rosie Buse, a principal consultant here at OSRL. Rosie has 14 years of experience as a global oil spill and emergency preparedness, incident management and crisis management professional. She holds a first-class Bachelor of Science degree in marine geography. Rosie co-authored the Net Environmental Benefit Analysis, or NEBA, IPCA Good Practice Guide, and has delivered training and exercises to European and African regulators. You'll also hear from Tim Coombs. He's an OSRL principal trainer with 22 years of experience as a marine engineer technician in the Royal Navy. Tim has responded to spills in Australia, India, Gibraltar, and the UK, as well as the 2010 Macondo incident. He's the chair of the IMS core group and has worked with several of our clients in the incident management teams and has delivered numerous IMS training sessions around the world. Finally, we're joined by Dawn Gibson, who's currently the Global Crisis Manager at Vodafone Group, where she's responsible for the end-to-end delivery of the crisis management program across all Vodafone Group entities. Prior to her move to Vodafone, Dawn spent 3 years as a response specialist with OSRL and further 6 years working in the Shell Global Emergency Management team as an oil spill and incident management expert. So without further ado, I'll now hand the floor over to Rosie Buse.
Thanks, Mandy, and hello everybody, welcome to our seminar. So I thought a good place to start this seminar would be with this orientation wheel. Incident and crisis management are so interlinked, and during this webinar we're going to touch on most of these points, so from definition through to the principles, characteristics, and we're also going to take a look at a scenario to see how the team, so an incident management team and a crisis management team, would work through their various processes. So yeah, that's where we're going to go, and welcome you on our journey.
So welcome everyone. So what we thought we'd do is we'd start this seminar off with asking you, the audience, if anyone could come up with a definition for what an incident is and for what a crisis is. So please do add those into the chat function. We'll give you a couple of seconds as those start coming in, and then what we're going to do is we'll actually give you what we know it to be. So let's start with, what is an incident? Well, so an incident is an unplanned event. This event will have serious consequences and a consequential risk on such things as human health and safety. So, for example, a fire occurring. It could also be a destructive impact on the environment. So, for example, in myself and Rosie's business, the oil spill incident. There could also be adverse impacts to public, private property, recreational, historic or archaeological sites caused by such things as hurricanes, floods or other natural phenomena. Most incidents, however, do tend to be local. However, they can occur together and become a disaster or, in worst case, a natural catastrophe. The thing is, with companies, they can survive these incidents, disasters or catastrophes. But if they start to endanger the survivability or the integrity of a company, then we have a crisis. Incident management teams will be focusing on resolving the incident. Crisis management teams are focused on the integrity of survival of that company, or in the worst case scenario, the termination with the least negative impacts.
So at what point then does an incident become a crisis? Sometimes it can be obvious, really sudden, like a natural disaster or a terrorist attack. Both of these are unexpected but immediately visible. Other crises can be expected but not immediately visible, so like a data breach or a theft, or a crisis could also emerge from an incident that has not been contained. So crises, and to set them apart from an incident, they're unique, they're rare, they have a higher sense of urgency, and pressure that can go on for a long period of time to make sure any impacts are minimised. To think about it in another way, when the core business or reputation that gives that business functionality is not affected, then it isn't a crisis yet, or at that point. Managing a crisis requires flexibility, creativity, and strategy for that sustained response, all at the same time as managing that with inherent uncertainty. So through effective crisis planning, you will have defined your criteria for when your organisation is in a crisis. So serious injury, financial damage, or even emotionally charged subjects. And I can see somebody in the chat has put a truly emotional event, because a lot in oil spill response, we see that a lot with oiled wildlife coming across in the media. And another sort of key point with a crisis is that scrutiny that the media places that comes with a crisis event. So yeah, definitely an emotional event. So incidents and crises are not exclusive of one another and need to be mutually supportive. And the difference between them, between incident management and crisis management, is one of focus. And that's what we're going to look at next. So for incident management, it's the tactical focus, and for crisis management, it's the strategic focus. And we'll just take a look now at the critical success factors for each of them.
So let's look at the tactical side, the incident management. So the IMT has several key focuses with respect to this. The first one, and as always, we're always looking at the safety of personnel. Now, this personnel will be members of the response team, the guys and girls out in the fields doing the actual rectifying of this incident, whatever it may be. But it's also focusing on members of the public, members of the media, because they may well also be involved, so affected. The incident management team, again, will be part of or directing those in the field to conduct those incident operations, trying to get things back to normal as safely and as quickly as possible. However, whilst they're doing this, they also need to inform the crisis management team of what they're doing, and also their supervisors. This could be members of the crisis management team. Whilst doing their job or their response, they are liaising with local and political agencies, and may also have to, or will also have to, liaise with the local communities to ensure that they're as least affected as possible. They also have to inform local media, and they must make sure that they are transparent with the media and available to the media.
So the crisis management team has a slightly different focus, and they'll be looking at the corporate body and taking care of the employees and the incident management team, but from that strategic perspective. The priorities of the CMT need to be aligned towards maintaining the integrity of company operations, business continuity and critical processes, profitability and also reputation. So, this is ultimately managing the crisis. The CEO and the board of directors need to be informed and aware of what the CMT are doing, as well as clients and customers. So understanding all of those stakeholders is really important. And so the CMT is ultimately concerned about reputation and making sure that the strategic communications with the media at a more strategic level are managed appropriately.
So, with both incident and crisis management, there are principles that need to be followed. Now, whether you are using an incident management system such as ICS, the Incident Command System, or as we use OSRL, the Incident Management System, IMS, both very, very similar, there are several key features. Some of the key ones are here, and then can be actually separated into two strands, being organisation and management. So I'm just going to go into some of those in a little bit more detail. So with the organisation, there is the use of a single integrated organisation to manage a response. So that only one organisation, they will be focused, everyone should know what they're doing, and everyone will be able to focus on their task in hand. Moving that on slightly is the organisation by function. So for example, IMS or ICS, you have a command function, you also have a general function. This will have various personnel doing various tasks such as operations, planning, logistics, finance and safety. There is also an establishment of a clear hierarchical structure or relationship, so everyone knows who they should be reporting to, talking to, where orders should be coming from, and passing that information back up the chain. We can maintain a modular and scalable organisation. So this system fits well for any size of incident. It could be just a small fire in a wastebasket, for example, or we could be looking at something like the Macondo incident in 2010, which actually had thousands and thousands of personnel responding to. With the management style principles, we need to ensure we've got an objective-driven response. We set our objectives, we look at strategies and tactics, and then we order our resources to fulfill those. We will also be formulating an incident action plan. So we're working early on, we formulate a plan, we communicate that plan and pass that down to the rest of the team. We speak the same language. We use common and consistent terminology, whether that's coming from, whether that's the personnel titles or the facility titles, and even down to the equipment that's being used. We also need to maintain a manageable span of control. We don't want that management style to get out of hand. We don't want one supervisor leading several hundred personnel. We lead just a few people under one manager, between 3 to 7, optimum being 5. Finally is the coordination of equipment, personnel, resources and communication. Communication is key. Without that, no one's going to know what's going on.
Okay, so then looking at crisis management principles, I've taken this list from the British Standard for Crisis Management Guidelines, and these 10 principles are what they have listed. So understand the situation, achieve control as soon as possible, ensure effective communications, and that's internally and externally. One that's really, integral is to be prepared with clear and universally understood structures and roles and responsibilities. Next one there on situational awareness. So that's either an individual or collective knowledge of what's going on, past and current, and how that might potentially have any future developments from that. And so making sure that situational awareness is built on good information management and challenge and collective working, bringing that all together. And also having a clear and well-rehearsed decision-making and action-driving process, which is aligned to the core values and objectives of an organisation. And just to sort of really focus on one more here, the effective crisis leadership, and that needs to be implemented at all levels in an organisation. And you can drill down even further with other principles just on crisis leadership. So making sure that the leader or leadership comes across with clear empathy, leads decisively, and other key principles of crisis leadership. Obviously, the other ones about resilient and competent teams, making sure all decisions are logged and recorded, and then having that reflection as well. So learn and evolve from lessons, sort of to complete the circle there. And ask yourself, has your organisation got all of these principles covered in your ICM setup? So just to sort of move on to the next slide, we've talked about the definitions and principles and general characteristics of both incident and crisis. But what does this look or feel like in reality or in an organisation? And this, depending on the size, the distribution, operations, the scale of your organisation, typically you would need to have 3 separate teams to run different elements as part of your overall risk management programme, along with those supporting plans. So on the left hand side, the preparedness and the prevention are part of your ongoing programme. So making sure those plans are up to date and your training is taking place regularly along with any exercises. But when that incident strikes, you have to have your site emergency response plan and team activated and your team in place, and an incident management team or a business support team overseeing the operations from a tactical perspective. If this develops into or already is a crisis, then the crisis management team would need to be mobilised to manage those strategic aspects of the crisis. Business continuity is also, coming in at this point, and that's the capability of the organisation to continue to deliver goods and services at an acceptable predefined level following that disruptive incident. So that allows the CMT to remain focused on the strategic requirements of the incident. And I just want to note here that your organisation may have different terminology for these teams, but the main thing to note is that there's a different focus, and that's acknowledged and implemented accordingly. So visualising these teams in a slightly different way, as shown here on this slide, just to give a sense of the scale. So as an incident becomes increasingly severe or complex, the IMT or the CMT would need to be activated, and where that tactical focus sits, can move up and down depending on your organisation, but the CMT certainly needs to remain focused on the strategic elements. The on-site team generally would be larger in comparison to the IMT and the CMT, totally depending on the incident. But as I said, the key here is about what those teams focus on. So the operational aspect for the emergency response team, tactical for the incident management team, and strategic issues for the crisis management team. To give you another example from a real organisation, that's how they've implemented this triangle. So pretty much what I've just said for those different levels. And that may be similar to your own organisation. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. You can see it's a slightly more complex, global, larger organisation with lots of different layers of management applicable to their organisation. So more levels of support built into their structure, but the same principles. And then finally, here's another large global organisation with 3 tiers, just presenting that triangle in a slightly different way. The same principles are applying. And the main point really to get across here is that you build something that works for your organisational setup, scale and operational risks.
So with both incident management and crisis management, there should be a process. Now, for incident management, what I'm showing here is the planning P. So this comes from the incident command system, incident management system that we use quite often in the oil and gas industry. And there's two phases of this planning P. The first phase, which is the leg of the P, this is our reactive phase. This is what we do once the incident has happened and those initial responses that we put into place. What we need to do is we need to move into the O of the P, so the top circular part. This is our proactive phase. Once we arrive in this part of the planning process, we are setting our objectives, our priorities and our tactics. We are then developing our plan, getting our plan approved, presenting it, and then going around the system of the process again. I'll be going through this a little bit more in depth as we actually start talking through the scenario that we'll be doing shortly.
So for crisis management, here's a basic flowchart of the crisis management process, and you've got the team assembled in the crisis management room. The leader would brief the team, and they set their objectives, think about those issues, and work on those action items. And as Tim said, we will come back to this, but I guess the key question here is what is the linkage, or where is the linkage between these teams? And two-way communication between the teams is essential. Failure on both levels can cause problems, amplifying the crisis, and you may want the role of a liaison between the teams, but It's the objectives, making sure there's linkage between the objectives between the two teams is filtering down and up again. You just want to click on, please, Tim. There we go. There's my little arrow between the teams. So making sure those objectives are aligned. The next topic to talk about really is preparedness, and it's so important to be prepared for both incident and crisis, and the value of your emergency response or incident management or crisis management plan is only as good as the competence of the team needed to implement it. And that competence needs to be built up over time and revalidated. Remember the point I made earlier about the inherent uncertainty and the need for flexibility, creativity, and that you can't really put in a plan. That needs to come from within the teams themselves, and they need to practice that and maintain the competence to do it. So, your crisis management plan and your training will only get you 80% ready. You can't plan for all crises situations. They're unique in their nature, they're rare, they're uncertain. And it's how the team react and respond to that gets you to your 100% readiness. And this figure really is just trying to demonstrate that time element required to build up your teams and to set up and implement different types of competence and training exercises. Finally, just to say, IMTs and CMTs would need to be trained separately due to their different focus and requirements, but ideally would come together in a larger exercise to test the communication links and build resilience together.
So just before I go into the scenario, I'm just aware that there are quite a few questions and comments being posted. We will try and either answer some of these questions a little bit later or towards the end of the seminar, or we may well come back to these and produce another little session. So there's some really good points being made, and I am trying to publish the ones as they come in as I see them. But let's just move back to the seminar itself, and I just want you to sort of visualize a scenario in your minds. So Company X has had quite a substantial oil spill from an offshore oil platform. This platform is quite close to shorelines. These shorelines are very sensitive. There are lots of sensitive wildlife, turtles, birds, some rare species as well. There is also, it's quite an idyllic location. So there is some nice sandy holiday beaches. It's obviously quite a highly emotive area to be having been impacted. There is also an industrial part as well. So we have some water plants that need to be running all the time. So they've had this spill. Those shorelines have been impacted. The emergency response team has mobilised, and they are the first on the scene. So hopefully you've got a picture in your minds of some nice beach you've been on holiday to. Unfortunately, it's now covered in oil. So what we're going to do for the next few slides is we're actually going to look at what each of the three teams here are going to do. So the ERT, the emergency response team, the IMT, incident management team, and finally the crisis management team. So let's start off with the guys and girls that are going to be on scene first. So let's look at that emergency response team. So they are going to carry out the initial response. They are going to respond. They're going to make the initial notifications. So it'll be that first call for help. Without that call, they're on their own. Okay, they may not need it, but they may well need some help. Now they're going to be responding with whatever equipment they have in country or to hand. And for a lot of places and a lot of organisations, this isn't a great deal. So very, very quickly, they are on the back foot. They will need to carry out that initial assessment. So whoever the on-scene commander is will be looking at what's happened, will be looking hopefully towards worst case scenario. How bad can it get? That on-scene commander will then also need to start setting some initial objectives. Now, these are normally based on pair. So people come first, then the environment, then the assets belonging to that company, and finally reputation. So they're going to set those initial objectives, may even, if they have time, look at some potential objectives, the IMT, if they do come in. Now, if the on-scene commander has called for help and has mobilised that incident management team, then there's going to have to be an initial briefing. They need to get that information to the oncoming incident commander. So whether you're using something like incident management system or the incident command system, there are things in place to help us do this. For example, with Ics, Ims, there is a 201 form, an initial briefing form. This is compiled and is used as part of that initial handover brief. So that was the ERT. We're now going to move on to the incident management team. So the on-scene commander in the emergency response team has pressed the button, made those phone calls internally and externally, but the IMT has now been mobilized. So let's just look at basically what the incident management team will be doing. And remember several slides before when I talked about the planning P, this is basically what the planning P will be doing and actually gets you doing. So the first thing is that incident commander needs to take command. He has to take that handover from the offgoing on-scene commander, and in doing so will be instigating that planning process. So he will be at the top of the planning, top of the planning P leg. Once that planning process is started, we can then start planning ahead. But it is really important to understand that the response phase is still ongoing. Even though that the incident management process is looking at planning ahead, it's important to remember that there are people on scene doing the response task as we speak. So the incident commander will be setting up his command structure. He will be putting square pegs, hopefully square pegs in square holes, getting the right team, getting the right people into those positions. Now, some organisations already have these teams formed up. They get the call, they mobilise, they go into their incident command post, whether that's in their head office or whether some of them, which were actually mobile, will move into a, for example, local hotel. Others don't necessarily have anything preset, and you will need to make sure you've got the right person in the right position. Now, once this command structure is put into place, we then need to review those initial priorities and objectives set by the on-scene team or the emergency response team and ask ourselves, are they still relevant? Do we need to change them? Do we need to set any more? As I've mentioned, we'll be looking at the priorities. Priorities are always based on pair: people, assets, environment, and reputation. Now, we can actually set our objectives according to pair. So we'll set objectives for people, we set objectives for the environment, assets, and our reputation. And there will more than likely be several objectives for each one. So once we've set our objectives, we need to communicate these objectives. So by using that process, we will be holding relevant meetings. At these meetings, different things occur, but the first one is we'll communicate those priorities and objectives so everyone is aware of what they're working to. We then move forward, and certain members of the team, for Ics, Ims, it'll be the objectives and the planning sections, they'll be developing strategies and tactics to achieve the objectives. Now, going back to our scenario, one of those objectives may well be to prevent or to protect the environment from any more impact from the oil. Can't say none because the environment has been impacted, or even reduce the environmental impact. Now, there's several strategies that we in the oil spill response organisation use. That could be using chemical dispersants. It could be using in situ burning. It could even be just using the good old containment and recovery of oil at sea using our booms and recovery devices. There are strategies. What we'll then be looking at is what have we got to put in place, or how can we achieve each of those strategies. So for example, with dispersants, 3 ways of doing this. We can use them subsea, we can use them aerially, or we can use them from vessels. So we'll pick one of those and that will become our tactic. So once we've got our strategies and tactics formulated, we can then look at what resources we need to achieve those tactics. So we're actually just going to be ordering the resources that we need. We're not going to have too many, we're not going to have too few. We should, in theory, have just enough. Once we've identified those resources, we'll be looking at compiling all the information that we need that's been dictated by the incident commander that they want in their incident action plan. So there are relevant forms, maps, charts, etc. So once all the information has been compiled, we'll then be drafting our incident action plan. Once that incident action plan has been drafted, it'll be submitted to the incident commander for approval. What normally happens in the incident management process is a meeting is held with the incident commander, he's presented with the plan, and then hopefully they'll give tacit approval. We get that verbal approval. There's normally 1 or 2 things that need to be completed, some dotting of the I's and crossing of the T's, for example, and then once that's fully compiled, it will be presented again in hard copy format, and the incident commander will sign and approve. Once this has been signed and approved, we'll then communicate that incident action plan to all those in our incident management team and to all those that are actually down on the ground doing the response actions. Once it's been communicated, we do execute the plan, we put the plan into place, and then once that's done, that's not the end of it. We repeat the process, but we don't go back to taking command as we would there. We go back to the review, the priorities and objectives, because what we're going to be doing is for the next operational period, are those priorities and objectives still applicable? So that's the IMT.
Thanks, Tim. So for the CMT, once they're notified and activated, it's got a bit of an echo. There we go. Is that any better? Once they're notified and activated, the leader would assemble the team, and the team needs to be made up of the most appropriate individuals, you know, with particular knowledge about the scenario, and it's not necessarily about the most senior persons in an organisation or job title. So getting the right people together in the room. The leader would then give a brief on the known facts, establish those facts, make sure they're true, check and recheck as they could be updated. And as a group, set those key objectives and look at those impacts again based on pair. Also important to assess the severity of the crisis against predefined criteria. The team members in the CMT need to think about those issues and the relevance to the objectives, and then prioritise those issues and develop an action plan. Always consider what the worst case scenario would be. What else could go wrong? You know, always ask that question. And what stakeholders need to be involved, and just work through those items. The strategic direction or strategic intent must be set and refreshed as per the review schedule for the crisis management team. Just to note as well, the crisis management team, they need to avoid reacting with emotion, pause. Part of the success of a response, and just make sure you behave accordingly to the company values, you know, that they're aligned. In parallel to all of this going on, you've got your crisis communications team preparing the statement within that golden hour. So establishing the facts, agreeing the strategy for the communications and the action plan, and preparing that first response statement. It's your first response statement that will be the one that's remembered, so it's important to take the time to get it right. And just to pick up a couple of comments in the chat, yeah, the media strategy should be coordinated and set at the CMT level with the right appropriate spokespersons in place. So we've covered quite a bit of theory up to now, and I thought we thought it'd be great to bring some realism to this seminar. So I'm going to hand over to Dawn now to explore those challenges that IMTs and CMTs face.
Thanks, Rosie, and yeah, thanks to Rosie and Tim for having me speak this afternoon on this topic. I've called my section Mind the Gap, and that's because I wanted to explore some of the challenges that we see when we have, you know, both an IMT and a CMT working together. And from what I've observed, I think a lot of those challenges stem from having either a gap in functionality and capability, or even a perceived gap by one of those teams. And I think each of those teams will naturally tend to fill a void that is either there or they perceive to be there, to try and yeah, cover that capability and that function. So some of the common challenges that I hear and that I see are things like, you know, we get the CMT getting into the weeds and into the detail and maybe encroaching into the IMT space in terms of some of the decision making. Equally, we have a CMT not really being able to draw out the right information from the IMT that they need, not knowing where to get it from or what's available to them and when. You know, I think Rosie and Tim showed the planning P and the CMT cycle, and I think it's really essential that both teams understand where it is that they can fit into those processes. And then another area which is often a bone of contention is also in the stakeholder identification and engagement as well. And it's about sort of mapping that out and making sure that everyone is covered once and no one is missed. So just to move on from that, then it's about establishing what the rules of the game are, the rules of engagement between those two teams, or their swim lanes. Some people refer it to swim lanes. Are they clear? Do we know how we're going to interact with each other? Do we know what types of information we can get from each other and how that can help us do our jobs? And although, you know, every incident and crisis will be unique and come with its own challenges, and it's important to review and refresh and refine those rules of the game and rules of engagement, it's important to establish those way before anything happens. So just like we shouldn't be meeting each other for the first time when it comes to an incident, we shouldn't be establishing how we're going to work with each other and those swim lanes between IMT and CMT. So definitely ensuring that we are training and exercising together as best we can to understand how we can support each other in doing our jobs to the best of our capability. And when it comes to exercises, you know, we're very good at analysing the lessons learned from those exercises and determining what to do the next time to improve those processes. But equally, if you run an exercise where it's gone really, really well, make sure equally you place attention on analysing the success of that exercise as well and what made it a success, and make sure that that is communicated out to the rest of your organisation of good examples of how an IMT and a CMT can work well together. The teams need to have confidence in each other, no doubt. So the stakes are high in an incident or a crisis, and we can't ask these teams to have blind faith in each other that each one is doing you know, a stand-up job. So what I would say is some of your crisis team members will not have seen an incident management team in full swing. So take the opportunity during exercises to show them what is going on, all the great work that is going on in that incident command post. You know, you will have your best and your brightest technical experts in that team working really hard to fix this problem. And it's important that your CMTs see that and they gain confidence from that, so they can go back to their crisis management team and focus on, you know, managing the reputational aspects of the incident, managing those high level stakeholders, shareholders, whatnot, knowing and having full confidence that they've got an excellent IMT on the job. But it works both ways. So again, unless your role in your organisation is related to emergency management every day, if you're in the IMT, it's probably quite an abstract concept, this CMT thing. So, you know, you've got a group of fairly senior people sat in a room somewhere taking some pretty important decisions. But do your IMT really understand what it is that your CMT are doing? So if you don't have this in your organisation, or you haven't done this, I really encourage a an awareness session, familiarity session with your IMT members of all levels to talk about what it is that the CMT are doing and what they're there to do in terms of support to the IMT. At a minimum as well, I would suggest your senior members of your IMT sitting in on some CMT training. At a minimum, I would say your command staff probably. And again, it just goes more towards that mutual understanding of what it is that each team is trying to achieve and how you can support each other. And particularly on that, I think it's really, really important that your crisis management team make good emphasis and repeated emphasis to your IMT, be that through the incident commander or whoever, that they are there to support them. So they are there to, bring additional company resources if needed. And it's important that they ask that question repeatedly. What can we do to support you? What obstacles are you finding that are a challenge for you in managing this incident? And what is it that we can do for you? Moving on from those challenges then, and sort of gaining the mutual understanding of what each other are doing and how to support each other. One of the other challenges that I've come across is a sort of gap between the initial response phase and your crisis management team. So some of my executive committee will come to me and say, I'm drawn into a crisis management team a lot and it's taking up some time, and I feel that I'm making sort of decisions that are more tactical sometimes, and I wonder why that is. And I think in your sector, in the oil and gas sector, a standard incident management system, fortunately, has become a normal thing. I think it's fairly well established in the sector and rolled out throughout the organisation. It's definitely not the case for all sectors. And your IMSs provide that structure and that standardized process for how you get from these incidents at the outset right up through the escalation up to a crisis. But what I would say is there any teams in your organisation that are slipping through the gaps, or any scenarios that may slip through the gaps? So go back to the drawing board and look at some of your scenarios and identify any team in your organisation that may wind up dealing with an incident. So I'm confident, in an oil spill scenario, your organisations are all over it. So it's very clear how we will become aware of an oil spill, how it would be dealt with initially, and how that escalation would flow up ultimately to the crisis management team if needed. But what about scenarios like cyber threats, insider threats, fraud, anything involving real estate teams, health teams? Are there any teams or any scenarios in your organisation where there's not an alignment to that incident management team? And if I could offer you any tip on that, I would say look at your teams that have maybe deep technical expertise on something, and that are adept at fixing sort of low-level incidents and problems day in, day out, but might not be aware of how to tap into those additional incident management resources in your company. Because if not, that's when you wind up with quite a senior crisis management team, again, trying to fill that void that has been left by an incident management team, or lack thereof. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about issues-driven crisis. So I have an operational background. I'm sure many of us on this call do. We're very familiar with things going bang and oil spill scenarios in particular. But there are lots of global issues bubbling along in the background that definitely have the ability to create a crisis in their own right, but also become amplifiers in another incident that may seemingly be unrelated even. So I would encourage you to go back to your organizations and find out how you're monitoring those global issues, how you're horizon scanning, and where that intelligence is coming into. So is it coming into one central intelligence hub, which would be lovely and ideal, but more often than not, you've got several streams of intelligence coming in at different points of the organization. And I'd say go and find out how that information is collected and analysed and tracked, and go and find some of your subject matter experts on some of these issues. So I'm talking about things like geopolitical instability, supply chain disruption, supply chain transparency, which leads on to things like, the Modern Slavery Act and human rights issues. Climate change, did I mention that one? That's a big one, obviously, and non-occupational illness, which is something that we've been dealing with over the last year now. You will have SMEs somewhere in the business that are tracking those issues, and I would encourage you to pull them into a conversation about emergency response and incident management exercises and ask them how those issues may play into your scenarios, because it may not be obvious at first, but they may become, amplifiers in that scenario. And it also then, again, coming back to understanding each other's role, will help the incident management team to understand some of the wider issues and questions that the CMT might be getting in their crisis management room that are not necessarily related specifically to the incident that we've got in front of us. So to sum up, in general, I think, there's a lot we can do to build mutual understanding and trust in one another. Let's do it before anything really goes wrong. And let's keep an open mind as to, what other factors can play into an incident or in a crisis. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions later, but thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dawn. So just to reiterate some of the what can go wrong things. So we've got a list here. Some of them have been mentioned, but just going to shoot through them quickly, and then Rosie's going to cover the why. And then I think what we'll do is, just as we finish, we've got a few good questions that we may be able to either quickly answer or maybe focus on another seminar at a later date. So going back to the what can go wrong, so confusion and conflicting priorities and objectives. So setting the same or incorrect objectives, so they contradict each other. That lack of awareness, which obviously is linked to the one before, and that poor communication. And I think, as all three of us have mentioned, communication is key. Without it, who knows what, or how do we know what we're doing? Those poorly managed incidents, they can turn into a crisis. If we don't get things right, a straightforward incident can go horribly wrong. Combining the two can cause key points to be missed, overlooked, or not considered at the right scale. So, something that we really got to think of and think about only gets sort of like glanced over. One of the things in the UK for the oil and gas industry is you have to have a plan, and if you don't have a plan, you'll be in trouble. Not having a plan, well, it's not relevant in the UK. You have to have one, but if you're not in the oil and gas industry, you may not have a plan, or if you do, you don't follow it. Failure to consider what's the worst that can happen. This is just a small fire in a wastebasket, but how big could it get? So how bad could it get as well? And also keeping it up to date. Things change, especially with your operation. So you might have had a plan, you've planned your worst case scenario, but you change and adjust your operation as things progress, and you're not keeping an eye on that worst case scenario. Taking too long to respond or not responding correctly. Sometimes, it will be okay. We don't need to worry about it too much. Well, we probably do, because if you don't, things are going to go horribly wrong very, very quickly. Expertise. There's a lot of it around. There's a lot of technical advice. There's a lot of expertise. More often than not, it's in our companies anyway. It's there. It's just down the office. However, if you need to use external companies and external advice, we need to use it. And failure to ask for help or failure to ask for advice can get us into trouble. Not having those roles and responsibilities that I mentioned right at the early stages of the seminar, not having anything in place, well, straight away we're on the back foot. And I've had this firsthand at an incident I responded to in West Africa. When I got in country, the manager of the production facility was also managing the incident, which was around about 20-minute fast boat ride away from his production facility. You just can't do it. You have to have a structure. You have to have something in place. So fortunately, we managed to get the client to get a dedicated oil spill manager in, and then we went from there producing just a basic structure, but it worked. Failure to recognise the risks, and finally is that reluctance to press the red button. Failure to ask for help.
So, you know, the reason why it goes wrong comes down to the lack of these key things, so not rehearsing the comms, the risk management, understanding that full picture, and all of the common themes are listed there. There are others, but, you know, the importance here is being aware of these and being prepared for them. They're all interlinked. If one starts to fail, you know, domino effect for the others. And, you know, what costs more, the preparedness for an incident or a crisis, or the incident or crisis itself? So to wrapping up now, and to come back to our seminar heading, how to bring order to chaos, and there's several elements that interplay with each other, but they all sit within the context of an incident and crisis management framework or programme, ICM, BCM, whatever it is called in your organisation. And if all of these elements are in place, so you know, reviewing your structure, your teams, your plans, training your teams, test, then if they're all in place, then regularly reviewed, then you should be ready to handle any chaos that comes your way. And just, you know, to go on to the last slide, thank you for listening to our seminar. We hope you found it informative, and thank you for engaging with us on the chat. Thank you also to Dawn and Tim. We have the chat function open now. If anyone does have any further questions, we'll be happy to help, and we'll have a quick look through those that have been sent so far. Also, let us know any follow-on topics that you'd like us to cover. Our email addresses are also there for anyone that would like to follow up personally afterwards. So we'll just take a quick pause and look at the comments, and thank you very much for your attendance so far.
We've got loads of questions. We'll just let the presenters kind of go through the questions we have so far, because we have some really good ones in there. But if you have any more questions, please do pop them into the chat function. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, this recording will be made available on our website afterwards, so you can forward it on to colleagues, or there were a couple of people having problems seeing the slides, so you'll be able to see the presentation recording afterwards. So as I said, the team's just looking through the questions now.
So I'm just going through them slowly. The first one that I came to, which is, you know, and this is just my opinion, so please don't take this as gospel, and Dawn and Rosie may be able to add to this, but the question was, any logical reason why informed local media better sits in incident rather than crisis team? I think it sits in both teams, because both will be dealing with different aspects. So for me, the incident management team are going to be dealing with the response side of the media. So what are they doing? How much has been spilled? Who's been impacted? And there'll be certain questions that we'll answer, and certain questions that we won't necessarily answer. And maybe some of the questions would be better focused towards the crisis management team. So that's my take on that one.
Yeah, your crisis management team are ultimately going to be upholding that the media strategy, and being really transparent, but making sure the facts and everything are versed well ahead of time, and you've got an appropriate spokesperson. You want to be getting out accurate and timely information, and making sure all messaging that comes across from the company is handled with the right level of empathy. So yeah, crisis comms is a big part of that as well.
Just to add to what Tim said there about the local media, I think particularly in an incident such as an oil spill, or one that does create a hazard for the local community, what you're telling the local media may be different to what you would tell international media, because you may want to use it as an opportunity to get your, safety messages out, such as, don't go to that area, or that beach is off limits at the moment, and that the information that you give to your local media might be slightly different.
Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Rosie. So the next one that I've just scanned down that has caught my eye, this question: doesn't the ERT effectively become a part of the ops section of a stood up incident management team, rather than a separate entity such as the crisis executive team? Fully agree. Again, it depends who makes up that emergency response team. So in an ideal world, while the emergency response team are continuing in country at scene, and then will become directed by the incident management team, yes, as part of the operations section, maybe even part of the planning section for surveys, etc. And I suppose it depends what the ERT's day jobs are. So some of the emergency response team may well be part of the oil rig maintenance team, etc. So they may well have to go back to their day jobs to maintain the safety and integrity of the asset. So you may well have to bring other responders in to achieve or to do what they were doing. So that's what I would say, with respect to the ERT. It's a tiered system, isn't it? So you'll start off with the ERT, then IMT, and probably around about the same sort of time, depending on the situation, whether you bring the crisis management team. But they need to be informed anyway.
There's one question here about the makeup of incident management and crisis management teams, and I would say the members typically are different. Different people make up the incident management team and the crisis management team. Your crisis management team are those more senior executive level people, but you may need to bring in technical expertise into the crisis management team if needed, but their focus is completely different. So if you have enough people to make up different teams and where they come from in the organisation, it would naturally fall into different those different teams.
There's another one that mentions the key buzzword in media, which is transparency. Ask what kind of information would you recommend should be withheld from the media? Information relative to casualties. We've got to be careful on what we give out. We wouldn't give out names, etc. We'd have to be careful with that. But I did see another one, which was a good one, which is very relevant to the UK. So this was from Andy. So referencing the working together in the title of today's seminar. The focus has been on vertical management structures, not horizontal. So i.e. working together with other agencies. How would the incident management team and the crisis management team integrate with multi-agency resilient partnerships forums, such as we have in the UK under the Civil Contingencies Act, depending on the nature of the crisis incident? The legal organisation of the multi-agency resilient partnerships may have primacy over certain aspects of the response, for example, reservation of live media, etc. For me, with going in, talking about the oil and gas industry, we all, virtually every oil and gas industry in the UK will use ICS or IMS, and we will have an incident commander. So in the UK, there is another command structure. So normally in ICS, IMS, we talk about unified command, area command, etc. There is another one that we will probably, or that we see in the UK, which is coordinated command. So you would have the oil and gas, or the oil company's incident management structure. You would then have, working alongside, you would have the government's gold, silver, bronze command structure, and also the Coast Guard's, and obviously those local resilience partnership as well. They'll be doing what they do. I think the key here is that liaison, and I've seen it firsthand whilst being part of some of the exercises, and it is that liaison part, because those agencies need to know what we're doing and we need to know what they're doing. For example, on a recent exercise, I was sat in the Marine Response Unit working with the Coast Guard, but I am working for the client. So we're looking at offshore response and how to do that, as are the MCA and the Coast Guard. So by working together and liaising, we actually worked very well because we weren't contradicting each other. So we are both trying to do the same thing. One's trying to do it for the government, we're trying to do it for the client. So it's having that liaison, and they do work together. And there's some really good points from Paul with incident management systems and FEMA and training and testing the communication. So some really good things there. So I've published those across so that everyone can see those. It would be great to see a PowerPoint on the difference between this is the old-fashioned one, the differences between ICS and IMS. How many times have I been asked that one? Maybe that's, I think, yeah, I'll take that one. Take that one away, maybe for another seminar or webinar in the future. So some really good points there. So thank you everyone for those. We haven't met, I think we've answered virtually all the questions, but there are some really good points there as well.
Yeah, and feel free to drop us anything that comes to you later after you've had time to reflect on the seminar. We'd be more than happy to reach out and respond to you if anything else does come in. So yeah, thanks very much everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you for me.